Good afternoon. My name is Emily Hawthorne. I'm here with my colleague Ryan, and today we get to talk about the geopolitics of the World Cup, which kicks off in the coming days in Qatar, a place that I visited multiple times that Ryan has lived in before. And so, why don't we? There's just so much we could talk about in terms of the sports, in terms of the geopolitics of these types of events. But why don't we start just by talking about what this means for Qatar to be hosting this?
Yeah. So let's set the stage here. Why do these Gulf governments even do these sorts of things? Like 50, 60 years ago, there was virtually nothing in Qatar and across the Arabian Peninsula in general. It wasn't a destination for anything besides energy. And so these mega projects, these mega events, what they're designed to do is create demand out of thin air. Qatar is trying to create demand for tourism. It's trying to create demand for investment by drawing attention to itself in a positive way. It wants to showcase that it is a modernizing modern city with a strong future ahead of it. And then the World Cup is basically a high beam that it can put on the city of Doha to get everybody to notice that this place exists and to make it a destination in and of itself. And we've seen this across the Gulf. You know, Saudi Arabia is still doing NEOM, the $500 billion city that at the moment, I believe the design is still that it's going to be in a straight line across the desert. But it's supposed to draw attention. And I think that's exactly what the Qataris are doing and have achieved. Everyone's talking about Qatar, and they will for the next couple of weeks. Some of it's positive, some of it's negative. We got to get into that. But the idea is to get attention. And in that sense, they have absolutely succeeded. And now comes the question of what happens after the games and what Qatar does with all that attention.
And yeah, and you bring up the key point of attention, and it's an honor to be able to host an event like a World Cup or to host the Olympics, and those are kind of like the two big global sporting events that have this kind of uh, just global attention. And the World Cup is really special because football, soccer, it's just such a globally popular sport. You're going to get millions and millions and millions of people watching this. So all eyes are going to be on Qatar for this period of time, like you mentioned. But there is, and also there's several things we could talk about, but a couple things that I'd love to just pull the thread on with you. One is, does this help create like the soft power dynamic that sort of build up the soft power that Qatar has been very good at building up via media, via sort of punching above its weight in terms of investing in things like the arts. And then the second component of that is that makes Qatar somewhat unique is it has a lot of money to be able to do this. It costs a lot of money to be able to put on this kind of event. And other countries that have bid for World Cups before or have won World Cups before, South Africa comes to mind. They've spent a lot of money, and it's been something of a financial disaster, depending on how you look at it. So those two dynamics for Qatar, I'm just curious your thoughts on it. The soft power dynamic, does this help Qatar? And then, and what's sort of the even angle of that building up that kind of soft power? And then two, the finances of it. Like, is this going to really hurt Qatar or is it going to help it in terms of finances?
Well, let's start with that finance question because there's a pretty clear answer to that. You know, this cost something north of $220 billion, and Qatar estimates it'll only get short of $20 billion back from the games itself. So it's a massive. It's like a $200 billion loss leader for them. But they're planning on double dipping on the infrastructure. The metro will obviously stick around. They want to host more sports events in these stadiums. The hotel will host future tourists. So they're not looking at it purely as okay, we've lost $200 billion and we'll never get anything back from this infrastructure. So that's what they're gambling on. The problem they've got is that they're doing this in a pretty competitive space. You know, the UAE has everything that Qatar has, and in some cases more. Saudi Arabia intends on having everything that Qatar has, and in some cases more. And these are all similar climates. They're similar tourist experiences. They're similar lifestyles if you're a worker these days, especially with Saudi Arabia's social reforms now loosening things up there. Uh, at the end of the day, Qatar is going to be facing it's still a gamble as to whether or not this was going to work out because brand Qatar, it looks very similar to brand UAE and will look very similar to brand Saudi Arabia. And then, in 10 years, I think we'll have the final definitive answer of whether or not these games were economically worth it. But Qatar is gambling that they will be. And there's really just no way to tell at the moment.
And Qatar has it's sort of the global leader in LNG, everybody needs more natural gas these days. So demand is very high for the resource that Qatar has amply available, and has been building out the infrastructure to be this global leader, in supplying countries with LNG. So Qatar has the sort of cash on hand to be able to do this kind of thing in a way that a lot of other countries couldn't. And of course, there's been controversy around that. Sort of looking at, why is this desert country hosting a World Cup? They had to even change the schedule of when they were hosting it, because you can't really play games outside in the summer in Qatar when World Cups are typically held. So there's also the benefit of working with a country that has the available funds to sort of build up all this infrastructure very quickly. But I agree with you that in terms of stadiums, in terms of the type of sort of arenas that can bring other sort of globally important and significant events and performers and teams to these countries after the World Cup, Qatar faces a lot of competition. I mean, and there are like regional specific things. There's the Asian Games, and there's all sorts of other sporting events that are more sort of regional, sub-regional. But in terms of globally significant events, it's a big question, right? If they're going to be able to, like, you couldn't really have an Olympics in Qatar, or could you in the future?
Right. Right. And that's, like we have the Brazil example where there's a stadium from the World Cup that's now being used as a bus depot. Will that happen to Qatar? Will they have to repurpose these into other things? Who knows? But as you rightly point out, especially LNG makes it so that this isn't going to cripple the Qatari economy. They're going to be fine no matter what, especially with the war in Ukraine and Russian natural gas being cut off from Europe. Qatar's LNG is even more in demand than ever, and will be for the foreseeable decade. So they can take the economic loss. Now, on going back to your other question about the soft power boosts from it, I'm a bit skeptical that they're going to get any more soft power boosts from this, in part because their soft power strategy that they had prior, in the years prior, it relied heavily on political Islam. It relied heavily on political reform. Those are two trends that in the Arab world have pretty much played out. And we've seen it even in places like Tunisia, that was the farthest, most advanced democracy in terms of what happened after the spring. That's now been rolled back. And so Qatar doesn't really have an opportunity to use its soft power for anything other than domestic purposes, making Qatar look attractive for investors and tourists. But abroad, I think Qatar's strategy was already outdated before the games, and that's not going to change because of the games. And that's just the world that Doha has to adapt to. But I'd be curious your thoughts if you agree with that.
I think I do agree with that. That there's sort of there's almost there was the emergence of Qatar on the global stage. There and that was sort of timed in the 90s with the emergence of Al Jazeera and the competition between the Gulf states in the 2000s with lots and lots of oil and gas money to be a more sort of prominent actor in regional and in global politics. And I feel like we've almost sort of reached the like, people are aware of Qatar. They know that it exists. It's a tiny, tiny country. But in terms of the global energy market, in terms of things, if you pay attention to things like, what's been happening in Afghanistan with the Taliban takeover, Qatar has been one of the regional countries that was sort of trying to help mediate and sort of work on, the logistics in the Kabul airport. Qatar has showed up in a lot of different spaces around the world and a lot of different theaters in geopolitics. And I feel like the World Cup is a sort of crowning achievement in terms of being regarded on the same level as these other big powers in the world. But there's not a bigger sort of stage to go to from here. So I think it does help sort of build up Qatar's ability to show what it has to offer. But I think also the risks there, and sort of when you invite global media attention, you're also inviting all just manner of negative media attention. And we've already seen that quite a lot leading up to these cups, questions about migrant rights, questions about just the Was there waste and corruption going into sort of the building of these stadiums and into the building up of the infrastructure, and will it actually serve the real residents of Qatar, et cetera? So yeah, so I tend to agree with you, but I also think we would be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about some of the other aspects of the geopolitics of World Cups, which is the inherent geopolitics in major sports tournaments. I think there's um, a lot of when you're viewing something like a World Cup or the Olympics, it's so fun to watch because you see a lot of country and cultural pride on display. And in a sense, you also see a little bit of rehearsed sort of play conflict between countries because you have countries sort of pitching literal teams of people against each other. Um, and again, as I mentioned, people really care about soccer. People care about this sport. So you know that you're going to have people watching all over the world. And so there's these interesting little interactions between countries when the countries get sorted into groups, because the tournament's going to start next week at the group level. There's always chatter about whether these countries get along, and the main group I think that we've seen, certainly in the United States, chatter about is of course the one that the U.S. team is in, and that's the U.S., U.K., Wales, and Iran. So when you have, and so there's interesting little tension points and fraternity between the UK team and the Welsh team. But of course, between the United States and Iran, there's a lot of symbolic geopolitics there because the United States and Iran is involved in a sort of multilateral cold conflict, with sanctions and aborted nuclear talks and proxy militia groups that Iran supports that are actively, in some places, uh, fighting or attacking sort of U.S. forces and interests. And so that does not mean that this match is going to turn into like an actual outright conflict. It won't. That would be absurd. But it will be really interesting to see. It, you don't see Iranian sort of diplomats and US diplomats sort of interacting in friendly and normal sort of diplomatic channels very often. So for an Iranian team to be playing a US team, it sort of puts them into a sort of normalized space where it's just one country fighting another country in a sport that everyone loves. And I think that that's one reason why the global dynamic of the World Cup is so much fun to watch, because you're going to see some of these matchups that you just, you don't typically see otherwise. There's also always the question too of is there going to be, are there going to be security challenges and those sort of things around the World Cup? And there have been questions about, would, because of the geographic location of Qatar being close to Iran and the various security challenges within the Persian Gulf, is there going to be, a security threat to the games? And there's always that question. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, for example, we have just this week, we had an attack on an Israeli tanker that was very likely carried out by Iran, just off the coast of in the Persian Gulf there, the Arabian Gulf, as the Gulf Arabs call it. So there's always the chance that there's some sort of Iranian provocation that could happen. There's always the outside chance that there's a lone wolf attacker, somebody with a knife, somebody who smuggles in a gun. Things like that are very hard for security forces to prevent. But there's also, it was interesting, bringing up the Iranians. Iran's in the middle of a very serious domestic revolt that's been going on for over a month now. And many authoritarian regimes use sports as a way to distract population, as a way to legitimize themselves, build up national pride. It will be very interesting to see how the Iranian players behave, whether or not any of them try to show any sort of subtle ways of displaying solidarity with the protesters back home, or whether or not people within Iran, watch the games, or if they rally to the flag as they might for the games, or if these games are maybe going to carry a political dimension on the domestic side for the Iranians because of that ongoing revolt. I'll be very curious to see if there's anything close to, the Olympians who raised their hands, in protests over the years coming from that Iranian team, because they're the one team that is really in a political challenge of going to Qatar and being let out of a country that right now is sort of on lockdown.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point regarding the what we should be watching for in terms of the Iranian team. Um, and also, just another before we depart too much from the sports chatter, and then we can come back to this question about
Mhm.
the Royal Air Force if they've been working closely with Qatar. Um, One interesting sports aspect of this World Cup is, of course, the matchup in skill levels between these different and talent within these teams. And I think this is only this could be one of the only times when we've seen the host country automatically gets into their national team gets into the sort of group level, even if they wouldn't have qualified otherwise. So Qatar is has not ever been in these championships before, whereas some of Arab teams, several of them, of course, have. Saudi Arabia has played its national team in the World Cup in numerous World Cups, but Qatar has not. But this will be the first time, of course, because they're hosting it. But it'll be interesting to see if they are able to get out of the group level. I think a lot of football watchers don't think that they have the sort of chops to do that, but they do get that's one aspect of sort of the honor and prestige of hosting the games is you get to play your national team against other teams that sort of made it to this really prestigious final level in world soccer, and that's one sports thing we'll be watching, and then of course there's all the other aspects of what to watch for in this World Cup in terms of sports, and a big one is is Argentina's a favorite. Are they going to actually win this year? It's going to be Messi's last time playing. And so I know in my household, where my husband is very, very into soccer, we'll be watching for things like that. The question of like, will Argentina take it home this year, or could it be Brazil, another big favorite? But we could talk about sports chatter forever. We do have a question about the RAF being involved in Qatar's military expansion, and do they intend to be gatekeepers for the sea region? I'm curious what your answer to that would be, Ryan, but absolutely the RAF as well as the U.S. Air Force is very, very active in Qatar, very, very active across all the Arab Gulf states. And we have talked before about the interesting geopolitics of that and how the US does want to sort of reduce some of its military footprint in the region, and the UK as well. But for the time being, that military cooperation is still very, very strong, very intact. And as long as there is the threat of things like Iranian attacks on some of the Arab Gulf countries, more likely Iranian linked attacks from places like Iraq or Yemen, there's still going to be a very strong imperative to have this kind of military cooperation. I don't know if you have anything else to add on that question.
Well, it's an interesting opportunity to talk about the security architecture of Qatar and how it fits into the wider GCC and the Iranian conflict. And Qatar is a major base for the United States Air Force at Al Udeid Air Base. The Americans are primarily in charge of security within the region, not expansively, not wholeheartedly. The United States won't respond to every Iranian provocation. In fact, their threshold for response we've seen has gotten higher over the years. So they need to see bigger events before you'd see the United States say striking Iran or retaliation. And Qatar has positioned itself to be an indispensable part of this security architecture, and that's also part of its soft power strategy. Because no matter how many jets they buy from the British or the Americans or the French or whomever, Qatar's population is still very small, about 300,000 people. Most of them are not going to be combat ready. Most of them are never going to be able to be the Air Force pilots. For them to secure their airspace and secure their seas and keep their land border secure, they need a great power sponsor like the United States. And while Britain used to be the colonial power in the region since 1971, that's been the Americans, and British political will for military adventures in the Middle East is very low at the moment, and so they need to keep the Americans as close as possible. And to that end, they were able to lobby designation of the major non-NATO ally designation earlier this year, which entitles them to accelerated foreign military sales within the United States. It gives them special status with intelligence, and it doesn't make it so the Americans have to respond to attacks on Qatar, but it makes it closer to that moment where the United States does act as a formal legal guarantor of Qatar's sovereignty. And the World Cup kind of fits into that as looking like a good guy, a responsible power. It improves their diplomatic standings with the countries that they care about, like the US, like the UK. It keeps those militaries more involved with them. In a time when European powers and the United States, they're all looking to Ukraine, they're looking to Asia, they're looking to exit the region, and Qatar is trying to find as many different ways to keep them at least somewhat committed to their regional security commitments within the Persian Gulf.
Yeah, I think that's a really good sort of broad strategic point on which to end it. As and we will be covering more, certainly in terms of security dynamics, but also we've got more coverage on sort of the geopolitics related to Qatar and to the World Cup on our website. So you can learn more about RANE's geopolitical intelligence solution at ranenetwork.com. Thanks.